Page 506, continued. The Renaissance, Renaissance criticism in England. Para. Literary criticism began in England during Renaissance. The first regular critics were three Cambridge friends, Sir John Cheke, Cheke, Roger Ascham, Ascham, and Thomas Wilson. Their primary object was to improve English as a means of communication for literary and other purposes along classical lines. Cheke emphasized that English, quote, should be written clear and pure, unmixed and unmingled with borrowings of other tongues, unquote, stop. Ascham in his Schoolmaster Ascham in his Schoolmaster 1568 emerges as an advocate of, quote, weighting English matter in the English tongue for Englishmen, unquote, stop. He also stressed on the need to keep English free from foreign terms. Wilson's The Art of Rhetoric, influenced by Cicero and Quintilian, is, according to Wharton, Warton, quote, the first book or system of criticism, unquote, stop. He pleads for plain and lucid style for prose, free from obsolete and strange words, both native and foreign. This is the first stage of the development of English literary criticism. In the second stage, a group of English intellectuals consisting of Sir Philip Sidney, Gabriel Harvey, Spencer, Edward Dyers, and few others formed a literary circle known as Areopagus, Areopagus. It was the highest authority as literary matters. These critics were concerned with the study of prosody in the light of the classical system of versification. Harvey's letters and Webb's Webb''s Discourse of English Poetry are the first systematic attempt to introduce classical meters into English poetry. Page 507, para. 1. Sir Philip Sidney. Sidney, Sidney, Philip, Philip. Sidney's An Apology for Poetry 1580 was occasioned by the publication of Stephen Gosson's Gosson''s treatise, The School of Abuse 1579, which was a ruthless attack on poetry. Sidney logically depends poetry, printing mistake. It should be defends, defends. Sidney logically defends poetry and explains its importance to a confused and perplexed age. In his definition of poetry, Sidney closely follows Aristotle. Quote, poetry, unquote, writes Sidney, quote, is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termeth, it, in his word, mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture, with this and, to teach and delight, unquote, stop. An apology for poetry is a rare and valuable critical document. It is the earliest attempt in English to deal with the poetic art practically and not theoretically. His ultimate test is of a practical kind, that is, the power of poetry to move to virtuous action. It may be called the epitome of Renaissance critical thought, critical though, printing mistake, because it takes into account the critical doctrines of ancient critics like Plato, Aristotle, and Horace. But he did not blindly follow their principle. He adopted them to suit his own purpose and ultimately propounded his own conception of poetry. Sidney believes that, quote, poetry is a natural human activity which enables men to sing of beauty and truth, colon, that it nurtures in them what is good and noble in order to satisfy their longings for an ideal world, semicolon, that on account of its being a concrete and inspiring revelation of human ideals rather than merely an instrument of moral teaching like philosophy, comma, it is in a sense a criticism of life, comma, and that it has an element of permanent truth, unquote, stop. He vindicated the honor of poetry and restored it to its ancient prestige and meaning. Sidney's marvelous treatise, quote, gives us a complete theory of neoclassical tragedy, comma, 100 years before the art poetic of Boileau, Poetiquue, Boileau, Boileau, unquote, stop. As a critic, he is judicious, creative, and original. The value of his work is permanent. 2. Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson, Jonson, an ardent classicist, was influenced by the ancient masters of Greece and Rome, Aristotle, Horace, Seneca, Quintilian, and many more. David Deutsch calls him, quote, one of the first significant neoclassic critics in English, unquote, stop. Timber or Discoveries, published posthumously in 1641, is a summation of Ben Jonson's critical principles and opinions. As a classicist, he stood for order, balance, restraint, and discipline in art and literature. He condemned the excess of passion, imagination, and expression, and pleaded for, quote, nothing too much, unquote, stop. He admired Shakespeare, quote, on this side of idolatry, unquote, but he was not blind to his shortcomings. Para. Ben Jonson expressed his views on style and diction. Words communicate sense and meaning. He remarks, quote, in all speech, words and sense are as the body and the soul. The sense is as the life and soul of language, comma, without which all words are dead, unquote, stop. Quote, language most shows the man, unquote, stop. In order to cultivate lucidity and clarity of expression, a writer must know fully what he has to say, choose apt words to say it, and arrange them properly in composition. In order to achieve excellence, a writer should read the works of the best writers, observe the best speakers, and carefully revise and rewrite his words and their arrangement. He was very careful about the choice of words. In this respect, he follows Aristotle, Horace, and Quintilian. Quote, custom, unquote, comma, Jonson says, comma, quote, is the most certain mistress of language, unquote, stop. By custom he means, quote, the consent of the learned, unquote, stop. Ancient words lend majesty to writing, but they should be intelligible, comma, unquote, since the chief virtue of style is perspicuity. He adds, quote, the eldest of the present and the newest of the past language is the best, unquote, comma, for both satisfy, quote, the test of familiarity, unquote, stop. A good writer must cultivate a taste for, quote, choiceness of phrase, comma, round and clean composition of sentence, comma, sweet falling of the clause, comma, varying an illustration by tropes, tropes, and figures, comma, weight of matter, worth of subject, comma, soundness of argument, comma, life of invention, comma, and depth of judgment, unquote, stop. Para. Jonson's bent for classicism is also visible in his dramatic criticism. He pays more attention to the theory of comedy than to that of tragedy. A comedy is reformative and hence it shows, quote, an image of the times, unquote, stop. It deals with, quote, human follies, comma, not with crimes, unquote, stop. His theory of comedy, his doctrine of humours as an absorbing singularity of character, grew out of the conception of decorum. In the field of tragedy, he followed the Senecan pattern. He lays stress on the unity of action which must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Para. He had a high conception of both poet and poetry. A poet is a maker. Poetry both instructs and delights. Para. As a critic, Ben Jonson stood for order, uniformity, discipline, and classicism in literature. Page 508. He foreshadowed neoclassicism, the creed of Dryden, Pope, and Dr. Samuel Johnson. Section. Neoclassicism in English Literary Criticism. Para. The neoclassical criticism spans about 150 years, from the middle of the 17th century to the end of the 18th. The rules of Aristotle modified and reinterpreted in Boileau's Ars Poetique, 1674, Rapin's Reflections and Bossu's Treatise on Epic Poetry, and the works of Racine, Comelle, Comille, and Saint-Evremond, influenced neoclassical criticism. Respect for rules is the main characteristic of this school. Pope wrote, quote, "Those rules, of old discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized, and learn hence for ancient rules a just respect. To copy nature is to copy them." Unquote. Para. Explaining the term nature methodized, Scott James writes, quote, "Avoid excess of insensate excitement, of verses monstrous ... Restraint is the first lesson of writing. Avoid, quote, sterile, unquote, abundance, nothing too much, exclamation. Let everything be in its place, and the beginning and the end respond to the middle, stop. Take the classics for your model, and copy them to the letter, ... Avoid the incredible, ... Shun low conditions of life, Choose heroes preeminent in valor and in virtue, ... Unquote. A vigorous intellectual quality which implies moderation, balance, correctness, reason, and good sense govern both creation and criticism during this period. John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Joseph Addison, and Dr. Johnson are the main critics of this period. 1. Dr. John Dryden, 1631 to 1700, the father of English criticism. John Dryden, says Scott James, quote, broke new ground as a student of the principles of literature, unquote, stop. Dr. Johnson considered Dryden as, quote, the father of English criticism, as the writer who first taught us to determine upon principles the merit of composition, unquote, stop. He begins a regular era in criticism. The critical utterances of Sidney and Ben Jonson are mere jottings on just a few things that interested them. Dryden, for the first time, convinced his countrymen that they could be as great critics as they had been poets. Para. Dryden's An Essay on Dramatic Poesy, 1668, is a famous treatise on criticism. Before it, he wrote two of his prefaces, the epistle dedicatory to rival ladies, asserting the importance of the heroic couplet for dramatic writing, and the dedication to Annus, A-N-N-U-S, Mirabilis, M-I-R-A-B-I-L-I-S. Those that followed this famous essay are a defense on an essay on dramatic poetry, prefixed to the Indian emperor, defending the use of rhymed couplet in tragedy. The apology for heroic poetry prefixed to the state of innocence, the grounds of criticism in tragedy prefixed to Troilus and Cressida, elaborating Aristotle's theory of tragedy and an analysis of the achievements of Shakespeare and Fletcher. Para. A great and discerning scholar, he combines the merits of both the native tradition and that of the classical. He was a poet and dramatist too, so there is a correspondence between what he says as a poet and what he does as a critic. He generally wrote his prefaces to justify himself as a poet. Dr. Johnson rightly calls him, quote, the father of English criticism, unquote, in the life of Dryden, because he was the first critic in England who was seriously preoccupied with the exposition of literary principles. Dryden's critical discernment of the ancients and the moderns enabled him to have a comprehensive view of literature, which Sidney and Ben Jonson had failed to enjoy. With Dryden begins a regular era of criticism. Dryden, Dr. Johnson remarks, quote, first taught us to determine upon principles the merits of composition, unquote, stop, para. Dryden was a progressive critic. In an era of neoclassicism, he emerges as a liberal classicist who would adjust the rules of the ancients to the genius of the age in which a poet writes. He found no harm in tragicomedy, which was condemned by neoclassicists. He admired, quote, the variety and copiousness of, unquote, the English plays with their, quote, underplots or by-concernments, and thus he discarded the French ideal of the singleness of plot. As a progressive critic, he refused to pay servile homage to Aristotle. Dryden affirmed, quote, it is not enough that Aristotle had said so, comma, for Aristotle drew his model of tragedy from Sophocles and Euripides, and, comma, if he had seen ours, comma, might have changed his mind, unquote, stop. He agrees that plot may be, quote, foundation, unquote, of a tragedy, but he does not agree with Aristotle, who said that, quote, plot is the soul of tragedy, unquote, stop, para. Dryden was the first critic who recognized the importance of objectivity, detachment, and reasoning in criticism. He did not underestimate the native literature of England and refused to overestimate the literature of antiquity, page 509. Literature is the expression of the genius of a nation. He writes, quote, and one reason of that success, comma, in my opinion, comma, is, comma, this, that Shakespeare and Fletcher have written to the genius of the age and the nation in which they lived. For though nature is the same in all places, comma, and reason too, comma, the same, comma, yet the climate, comma, the age, comma, the disposition of the people, comma, to which a poet writes, comma, may be so different that what pleases the Greeks would not satisfy an English audience, unquote, stop. Thus, Dryden first of all introduced the notion that literature is an organic force which grows and develops with the growth and development of a nation. T.S. Eliot observes, quote, the great work of Dryden in criticism is that at the right moment he became conscious of the necessity of affirming the native element in literature, unquote, stop, para. Dryden pioneered comparative, historical, and descriptive criticism. As a pioneer of comparative criticism, he compared the modern literature with Greek and Latin literature. He also compared the worth of one writer with that of another. Thus, he highlighted the individual characteristics of some writers. Comparing Ben Jonson with Shakespeare, he observes, quote, if I would compare him, Ben Jonson, with Shakespeare, comma, I must acknowledge him the most correct poet, but Shakespeare the greater wit, stop. Shakespeare was the Homer, or father of our dramatic poets, Johnson was the Virgil, the pattern of elaborate writing, I admire him, but I love Shakespeare, Dryden also anticipated the historical criticism. He first of all shows a well-developed sense of history. He recognizes the vital truth that literature is not static, but a dynamic process. He remarked that, quote, Aristotle himself might have revised his rules and rules had he lived in modern era, unquote, Literature is ever growing and changing, and the rules and literary values must also change in correspondence to the changes in the literary and social conditions of the age. English criticism before Dryden was either theoretical or legislative. The critics were mainly concerned with laying down rules and to evaluate writers and their works in the light of the prescribed rules. Dryden began his critical career as a legislative or theoretical critic. His essay on dramatic poetry, quote, is a work of legislative criticism, though secreting within itself the first critical analysis of a literary work in English, the Examen, E-X-A-M-A-N of Ben Jonson's The Silent Woman, unquote, The Examen is the first example of descriptive criticism in England. Dryden's prefaces mark, according to Watson, quote, the silent transformation of English criticism, unquote, The second part of his dedicatory letter to his first published play, The Rival Ladies, anticipates descriptive criticism. Dryden's achievement, says Watson, quote, ultimately lies not in analyzing much or in doing it well, but in providing the inestimable example of showing that literary analysis is possible at all, unquote, para. Dryden's views on poetry. Dryden's views on poetry are similar to those of Aristotle. Throughout the essay, drama is treated as a form of imaginative literature, quote, a just and lively image of human nature, representing the passions and humors, and the change of fortune to which it is subject, for the delight and instruction of mankind, unquote, He accepts the conception of imitation, but it does not mean the photographic representation of human nature. The word, quote, image, unquote, implies, quote, making a beautiful resemblance of the whole, unquote, The purpose of poetic or artistic imitation, according to Dryden, is to create something superior. Imagination, for which Dryden uses the word, quote, fancy, unquote, tempered with judgment, helps the poet in the process of creating just and lively images of human nature. The function of poetry is, quote, the delight and instruction of mankind, unquote, Para. Dryden's essay on dramatic poetry. It is the greatest critical work of Dryden. According to Wimsatt, W-I-M-S-A-T-T, and Brooke, it, quote, is the most ambitiously constructed critical document of his career and the most important for general literary theory, unquote, It was written as a reply to some highly uncomplimentary remarks of a Frenchman, Samuel Sorbier, S-O-R-B-I-E-R-E, in the account of his voyage. He condemned English comedies for not following the three unities, especially the unity of place. In his address to the reader prefixed, the essay Dryden says that his aim was, quote, to vindicate the honor of our English writers, from the censure of those who unjustly prefer the French before them, unquote, His aim was, however, much wider, para. It is written in a dialogue form in which 4 persons participate. None of the persons states the whole truth. Every speaker frankly states his viewpoint. Nothing is stated with any finality, and in the end the readers are left to draw their own conclusions. Para. Critics, the first participant, expound the extreme classical view that the Greeks and Romans fully discovered and illustrated those perennial rules to which the modern drama could no better than to conform. Page 510. CRITES, Crites, perhaps, stands for Sir Robert Howard, Dryden's brother-in-law. Eugenius, Eugenius, who was perhaps Dryden's friend, Sackville, Sckwill, contradicts critics' classicism and takes the side with the moderns. Lycidius, Lisideus, who stands for Sir Charles Sedley, justifies the importance of classical rules. He admires the French who followed them with perfect fidelity, and hence they are superior to both the ancients and the moderns. Neander, Neander, who is Dryden himself, demonstrates the superiority of the English over the French. He also justifies English tragicomedy because it is a pleasant way of writing not known to the ancients or moderns of other nations. Having defended the variety of English drama, Neander turns to individual dramatists of the previous age, Shakespeare, Beaumont, Fletcher, and Ben Jonson. Para. Appreciating the highly candid, impartial, and impassioned discussion in the essay Tillyard, Tillyard writes, quote, ... This perfection of tone in matters of comparative literature, that was not equaled before or since, is Dryden's paramount critical achievement, . Dryden's place in literary criticism, Dryden's place as a literary critic is unassailable. He lived in an age of changing critical values, but still he kept his balance of mind and placed criticism on a high and sound footing for the guidance of future generations. Atkins remarks, quote, his reputation as a critic rests on sure and lasting foundations. In an age of transition and much confusion, he set criticism on new and fruitful lines, pointing to other methods and standards than those recommended by the French neoclassical school. And his work remains today as readable and suggestive as ever, the legacy of one of the greatest of English critics, . 2. Joseph Addison. Addison's best criticism is contained in the papers he contributed to the Taller and the Spectator. His papers on True and False Wit, on Tragedy, on Paradise Lost, and on the Pleasures of Imagination are of great classical significance. Para. Enunciating his general purpose in the Spectator, Addison wrote that his purpose was to bring, quote, philosophy out of closets and libraries, schools and colleges, to dwell in clubs and assemblies, at tea tables and in coffee houses, . This approach gave a new turn to criticism. Critics before Addison were concerned with the writer, Addison's concern is for the reader, quote, what books he should like, and how he should like them, . His program was to refine the taste of the reader. So he endeavored to establish among readers a taste for understanding polite writing. In order to understand a writer thoroughly, readers should be capable of, quote, entering into the sound and sense of an author, . In order to cultivate sound taste for reading, readers should read time-tested, celebrated works of antiquity and the modern works, quote, which have the sanction of the politer part of our contemporaries, . If a reader fails to enjoy or admire such works, he lacks in the faculty of judgment. This faculty to some extent is the gift of nature, but it can be acquired by reading the works of great masters, conversing with men of polite learning, and cultivating familiarity with the works of outstanding critics. Para. Addison had a high opinion about the function of criticism. To him, literary craft was more than a matter of mere rules. Something more was required in criticism than slavish imitation of classical rules to all kinds of writing. Critics should, quote, enter into the very spirit and soul of fine writing, and show us the several sources of that pleasure which rises in the mind upon the perusal of a noble work, unquote, stop. He even admired deviation from rules in case of the production of a work of high literary excellence. Addison thus shows a broader critical outlook than was common in his age. Para. Addison's criticism is of two types. It is neoclassical, as in his examination of tragedy, and Milton's Paradise Lost. It is aesthetic, as in his theory of imagination and in his utterances on the art of criticism. He emphasized that judgment in literature depended mainly on taste. His aim was to cultivate the taste of the age, not of a few, but of society at large, and he succeeded in his aim to a remarkable degree. Commenting on Addison's contribution to criticism, George Saintsbury remarks, quote, he represents the classical attitude tempered, not merely by good sense in quintessence, but by a large share of tolerance and positive good taste, by freedom from the more utterly ridiculous pseudo-Aristotelianisms, unquote. Number 3, para, Alexander Pope. Pope's chief critical works are Essay on Criticism, 1711, Imitations of the Epistles of Horace to Augustus, 1733, Preface to the Works of Shakespeare, 1725, and Preface to the Translation of Iliad, 1715, page 511. His essay on criticism, one of the most remarkable documents in neoclassicism, is modelled on Horace's Ars Poetica. Wider's De Arte Poetica and Boileau's L'Art Poetique. It lacks in originality. Lady M. Wortley, W-O-R-T-L-E-Y, remarked that, quote, it was all stolen, unquote, para. Pope highlights neoclassicism in the Essay on Criticism. He begins it by lamenting the corrupt taste of his day and aims at restoring it. Conformity to nature is essential for the cultivation of sound judgment and taste. Quote, first follow nature, and your judgment frame. By her just standard, which is still the same, unquote. Para. He defines criticism as, quote, true taste, unquote, which is a gift of nature, but it should be disciplined by the rules devised by classical writers. Pope writes, quote, the rules of old discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized, unquote. He exhorts the poets, quote, learn hence, for ancient rules are just esteem, to copy nature is to copy them, unquote, para. Two requirements, study of the ancient models and knowledge of their technique, form the very basis of Pope's critical theory. He allows, quote, lucky license, unquote, a slight deviation from rules if it contributes to the creation of beauty in a creative work. Like Dryden, he also assigns an important place to the spirit of the age. Para. According to Pope, criticism is the art of judging aright. A critic's natural ability for judgment should be properly trained. He should be well versed with the rules of the ancients and should judge a work not in parts but as a whole. No undue importance should be attached to the false brilliance of conceits, diction, style, or versification. A critic should be learned, disinterested, impartial, and unprejudiced. 4. Dr. Samuel Johnson, para. Dr. Johnson's criticism, which was written after the age of 40, falls into 4 groups. First, his critical interest is discerned in a dozen papers which appeared in the Rambler and in his remarks on poetry in Rasselas, Rassclas. Secondly, there is the dictionary, quote, itself a critical endeavor, comma, as well as a program and aid for future criticism, unquote, stop. Thirdly, there the edition of Shakespeare, preceded by the proposals for printing the dramatic works of Shakespeare. Fourthly, there is his magnum opus, comma, the Lives of Poets, in which, according to John Watson, quote, he explains his learned reputation to evaluate the English poets of the past 100 years, comma, an inquiry into taste, ... unquote, para. Johnson was the literary dictator of his age, comma, quote, the great charm of literature, unquote, stop. His influence determined and shaped critical theory in his age. He exposes the defects of contemporary criticism and distrusts taste and beauty as test of literary values. Beauty, comma, vague and undefined, different in different minds, and diversified by time and place, unquote, comma, cannot be the sheer test of literary judgment. His aim was, quote, to clear the mind of cant, C-A-N-T, unquote, stop. His approach was purely rational. The business of criticism, according to Johnson, was to free literary judgments from the, quote, anarchy of ignorance, comma, the caprice of fancy and the tyranny of prescription, unquote, stop. It was to evaluate a piece of literature purely on rational ground. The search for good taste can only be considered historically and relatively, because what is beautiful in one generation is ugly to the next. A work of literature should be judged as a whole and not by different parts. Para. Dr. Johnson had definite views about the nature, function, and technique of poetry. In the Life of Milton, he remarks that poetry is, quote, the art of uniting pleasure with truth, comma, by calling imagination to the help of reason, unquote, stop. This definition contains both the nature and function of poetry. In imitating truth, it is guided by reason and is affording pleasure by imagination. In the preface to Shakespeare, he writes that, quote, the end of poetry is to instruct pleasing, unquote, stop. Therefore, quote, its effect proceeds from the display of those parts of nature which attract, comma, the concealment of those which repel the imagination, unquote, stop. Poetry, quote, pleases many and pleases long, unquote, because in it the poet recognizes the intimate presentation of his own thoughts, words, and deeds. Para. Johnson's remarks on the classification of poetry are remarkable. Epic poetry is the best. He does admire pastoral elegy because of its unrealistic and unconvincing presentation. He also finds Pindaric, Pindaric ode, quote, unsuitable for modern age, unquote, stop. As regards versification, he preferred regularity and fitness. Johnson remarks that, quote, the essential constituents of metrical composition, unquote, are, quote, the recurrence of settled numbers, unquote, and the presence of rhyme. He disapproved blank verse because it, quote, seems to be verse only to the eye, unquote, and there is, quote, neither the easiness of prose nor the melody of numbers in it, unquote, stop. Para. Dr. Johnson writes about the poetic diction that, quote, words too familiar or too remote, comma, defeat the purpose of a poet, unquote, stop. Page 512. Such words should be carefully avoided. It is the happy combination of words which distinguishes poetry. Just an apt simile which illustrates the meaning or intent of the poet properly must be used. Para. Johnson expressed his views on dramatic artist's nature, the unities, dramatic pleasure and tragic comedy. Drama, being a species of poetry, must hold up, quote, a faithful mirror of manners and of life, unquote, stop. It should present human sentiments in human language, unquote, stop. The characters in a play represent men in all ages. Defining drama, Johnson writes in the preface to Shakespeare, quote, drama, therefore, is just a representation of human nature, both in its workings in individuals and in humanity at large, unquote, stop. He defends the use of three classical unities. He defends tragic comedy because it is nearer to, quote, the appearance of life, unquote, stop, para. Johnson's criticism of Shakespeare, which is contained in Observations on the Tragedy of Macbeth and the preface, is of lasting value. The preface, in the words of John Watson, is, quote, in essence a brilliant exercise in descriptive criticism. Johnson's first extended attempt at the form, with a major essay in theoretical criticism, The Reputation of the Unities of Time and Place, inserted midway, and a long appendix on editorial method, unquote, stop. Johnson's criticism of Shakespeare is conspicuous for its clarity and rational approach. No other critic, writes John Bailey, quote, has equaled the insight, sobriety, lucidity, and finality which Johnson shows in his field, unquote, stop, para. Dr. Johnson's dictionary on original work of great scholarship has a critical purpose too. In it, he defines a critic as, quote, a man skilled in the art of judging literature, a man able to distinguish the faults and beauties of writing, unquote, stop. He himself writes in the preface, quote, as by the cultivation of various science in a language is amplified, it will be more furnished with words deflected from their original sense, unquote, stop. Para. Johnson's Lives of Poets, a collection of 52 literary biographies, is, quote, the richest, most beautiful, and indeed most perfect production of Johnson's pen, unquote, stop. It is a landmark in the history of criticism. It is the first systematic work of a biographical critical nature of 52 poets from Cowley to Gray during a period of 100 years. The structure of each biography is divided into three parts: biography, character, criticism. Johnson is the first biographical critic. However, his judgment has often been vitiated by prejudices and deficiency in sensibility, as in case of some pronouncements on Milton and Gray. Macaulay remarks that, quote, they are the judgments of a mind trammelled by prejudice and deficient insensibility, but vigorous and acute, unquote, stop. Johnson's The Lives of Poets, says T.S. Eliot, quote, is the only monumental collection of critical studies of English poets in the language, with a coherence, as well as an amplitude, which no other criticism can claim, unquote, stop, para. Dr. Johnson, according to Eliot, is, quote, one of the three greatest critics of poetry, the other two being Dryden and Coleridge, unquote, stop. He was the ardent champion established conventions and the, quote, high priest of classicism, unquote, stop. His criticism belongs to the age of prose, reason, and good sense, stop.